Good afternoon and welcome to Meadowlarkers 57. 57 honorary captains for today. We didn't even talk about it, but we got to go. I'm going to go 57. New England Patriots linebacker Steve Nelson. Let's go with the great K-Rod from the Los Angeles Angels of Anaheim, Francisco Rodriguez. We could also go with the great Louisviller and Denver Broncos linebacker and ESPN colleague, longtime colleague, Tom Jackson. But maybe the winner is ketchup. Heinz 57. Is there any more famous number?
There you go.
Than 57?
Howard, you prepped for this.
Right?
You had to have prepped.
I did not prep for this.
You don't just pull Heinz out of nowhere, do you?
The most famous 57 out there, right?
Yeah, Grant, did you have 57s percolating in your mind as Howard was reeling those off?
I'm
going to wait for Derek Thomas at 58.
58 next week. That's right. Next week. Next week's a big one. A lot of good 58s out there. We have Kate Fagan. We've got Amin Hassan as always, but we also have a special guest. We've got the great Grant Wahl with us, who is live and direct from Qatar or Qatar or however we're pronouncing it these days. And I want you to look very closely. He looks safe. He looks happy. He is smiling, even though the background looks like it's a hostage video. My captors are treating me kindly. They would like their demands met. We have a lot to talk about. Obviously, we're going to talk to Grant, obviously, about everything that's happening over there. Big game Saturday, United States and the Netherlands and the quarterfinals, the knockout stage. But before we get started, I just wanted to finish off. Grant, I don't know if you've seen the Netflix documentary FIFA Uncovered. We talked about the first couple episodes last week, and I finally finished it. I think, Kate, you had seen the whole thing. I hadn't seen the whole thing. And I just got to say that as enjoyable as it was, I just don't think it stuck the landing. I was waiting in the final episode for the big bombshell that none of this goes down if the United States hadn't gotten rooked earlier, and that this was what was going to happen when the Justice Department gets involved. And it all just went away kind of meekly. Thoughts on the end, Amin, Kate, somebody go.
Well, I want to hear Grant's thoughts first.
Or Grant's thoughts on it as well.
Yeah. I mean, I ended up seeing all 4 episodes right before I left for Qatar, so I was glad I was able to do it. I know Daniel Gordon, the filmmaker. He's done a lot of good stuff over the years, including on all the Liverpool fans who died at a game many years ago. Just, it's tremendous, 30 for 30. And this one, the challenge for them is they weren't going to break any new news because there's been this forensic investigation that the U.S. Department of Justice has done using subpoena power for many, many years. They were working on that investigation long before the big sting day in 2015, and a lot of these cases continue now. So there wasn't going to be some bombshell of new information that came out of this, and the success, in my opinion, was going to come out of who did they get to do interviews with them, and they did get quite a few of the main players, including people like Sepp Blatter. They also, I thought, told the entirety of the story in a way that was pretty well done, that kind of scope-wise had everything in it. Personally, I thought the first episode could have been a lot shorter. I liked 2, 3, and 4 better. And they didn't really get into where is FIFA today. And I do think that's an important question about, has FIFA changed, since that day, those days in 2015 when the arrests were made and Sepp Blatter resigned and all of these indictments went down, and there really wasn't anything about that. And I think that's an interesting question. But they did make a clear point to say, because there's a lot of people where I am right now in FIFA land that say, well, the U.S. government only started investigating because the U.S. lost the bidding for 2022 to Qatar, and Bill Clinton was there that day in 2010 when the decisions got made. But actually, the investigation started several months before that day. So that sort of ruins the cause effect that so many sort of anti-U.S. people have tried to say, including here where I am around the World Cup.
Yeah,
and Grant,
I'm sorry, Kate, go ahead.
Well, yeah, let's just stick on FIFA Uncovered since it's coming off of last week. And we had some follow-up questions now that we've all seen it. You had just mentioned, Grant, that the doc doesn't do a complete job, or at least that was my inference, right, of showing us where FIFA is now. And if, Infantino and the new regime of FIFA are any less corrupt, or what structures have been put into place to ensure that bids and distribution of the World Cup is actually some sort of level playing field. And all we heard throughout the doc, and they did land great interviews, was even a few of the women at the end who were brought in to kind of do a white paper on what FIFA could do to make sure they had better governance. They were sort of just shown the door without seemingly implementing any of that. As somebody who's super plugged into that world as much as you know, what changes have been made, and how would you assess where FIFA is? And so when we find out who is going to be hosting in 2030, we have assurances that we feel like the best country or countries are chosen.
I mean, it's very clear. Gianni Infantino, when he took over as FIFA president and won the election in 2016, there were real hopes that he would usher in this new era of FIFA and it would be cleaner. But he has basically run the Sepp Blatter playbook ever since he took office, and actually taken it to a new extreme. And the Sepp Blatter playbook is, I get power when it's one country, one vote in FIFA elections. I get power from helping make sure that all the Caribbean countries are individually taken care of, all the African countries are taken care of. A lot of the countries around the world that provide big numbers of FIFA votes, but aren't traditional sources of power in the game in Europe and South America. And so what Gianni Infantino has done is just say to the individual federations, I will make sure FIFA sends you even more money than you've ever gotten from FIFA before. So the World Cup, the Men's World Cup, is almost FIFA's only revenue producing event. And so it happens once every 4 years. It's going to produce, this one, probably $7 billion in revenue for FIFA. And then FIFA distributes a lot of that money to the individual federations around the world. And for a lot of these small countries, that is by far the majority of the revenue that they get in a year. It's not from any of their own games or anything they do in their own country. It's what FIFA gives them. And so Gianni Infantino is running for re-election later this year. He's the only candidate, which tells you a lot about FIFA democracy. And so that's the Sepp Blatter playbook. Now, do we then take that to extend to there's corruption in FIFA today? That's where we haven't seen a sting operation like we saw in 2015. It certainly doesn't mean FIFA is clean now. It just means that we're not seeing sting operations. And a lot of times what would happen is the money would go to these individual countries and FIFA wouldn't do much at all to see where the money actually went. And a lot of the time it's gone into the pockets of X nation's federation president to some political crony in that country. So that's what we don't really know, is the money going towards soccer in a lot of these countries around the world? Not 100% of it is, I'm certain of that.
Yeah, I mean, we always say that, the culture changes you before you change the culture. And I think Infantino sort of a part of that, but also, I mean, we were saying, I mean, when I was thinking about the episode 4, not sticking the landing, I actually wasn't talking about Daniel Gordon or the documentary, but more whenever we heard this during the steroid era as well, when the federal government gets involved, they've got a 99% conviction rate. And it really did sort of set up that these guys were going to come in here, even though they were kind of out of their league because it was more international. It just didn't seem like the power of the U.S. did a whole lot against this sort of FIFA machine. I mean, go ahead.
Well, Howard, I mean, that's the funny thing, because we've seen other similar incursions by federal authorities into sports, in college basketball, the pay for play among amateur athletes and all that. And without fail, they always seem to go after small fish. Never the people that we all know are the real power players. And B, they like to make a big show of the press conference with a lot of puns from the sport that they are prosecuting. It is very much winning the press conference for them.
This is the World Cup of corruption.
And we're going to find that a lot of people are offside. I mean, it's the same thing. It's the same thing with the college basketball stuff. They're paying the amateur players. It's we're going to find that the shot clock has expired on this paper. Oh my guys, just present the indictments and let's go on with it. You don't have to wow me with your wit. And so that's why I ask. Pretty much what everyone's asking, what's changed? But I guess let's take a step back, Grant. What could change? What is a way that they could take meaningful steps to fight corruption within FIFA?
I think what would have to happen is at this point, and we get these rumblings every once in a while, including right before the start of this World Cup, when the FIFA president made this speech that was essentially saying the West can't challenge the rest of the world on human rights due to the history of the West, and took something that was a legitimate point, I thought, that he said Europeans for 3,000 years have done bad things to the rest of the world. And I include Americans for the last, or the U.S. government for the last 200 years, 300 years. But then Infantino took that to say, well, then you have no standing to challenge Qatar on migrant workers' rights or LGBTQ rights or women's rights. And that to me was a weird, outrageous leap from one thing that I sort of agreed with to a thing that I didn't agree with. When that speech happened, you had European countries talking about, well, maybe we'll secede from FIFA. And there's this constant battle between the European countries in particular and FIFA, because so much of the money in world soccer is in Europe. And the Europeans feel like FIFA takes advantage of them and what they bring to the table. If there ever really was a severe threat of top European countries pulling out of FIFA, then I think you might have some change. But it's not a real threat. It's not something where England's going to say, I just don't see them saying, we're pulling out of FIFA.
No Brexit? Brexit style?
They want to be part of the World Cup. And I get it, but the way I looked at it was the U.S. government and the DOJ was the first entity that actually caused fear in FIFA executives. They didn't fear anything. That's why for so many years, they were just so brazen with what they did. And as a journalist, it was tough because we don't have the power to do forensic investigations, right? Like they do. And it's, I feel like I certainly wish I would have done more reporting to expose CONCACAF and Chuck Blazer and people in our backyard. But it was really hard to do that. And U.S. soccer, by the way, during that whole stretch, just sort of put their head in the sand and they were like, yeah, we know these guys are shady, but they're our shady guys and we're not really going to blow the whistle on them.
What was because I wanted to ask you about Chuck Blazer as somebody who is consistently reporting and involved in U.S. soccer and soccer worldwide when he was at, I guess we could call the height of his powers, even though it was hard to understand because it wasn't like he was bringing a skill set to the table, it seemed like. And we talked about this last week on Meadowlarkers.
Yeah. He brought a skill set, all right.
The skill set being politics, not, like some long pedigree in soccer. So what was your understanding? I mean, this must have been a guy, Chuck Blazer, that you saw around the major tournaments and you knew his standing in CONCACAF. It like any major sports story, when you're kind of around, you hear whispers at times. But sometimes you're not quite sure where they all piece together. What was your general understanding of what was going on at the height of this?
Yeah, and at the height of this, we're talking about Chuck probably being at the height of his powers right around 2010, when the vote was taken to give the hosting rights to Russia for 2018 and Qatar for 22. And, Chuck did make a lot of money from his deal with CONCACAF, which was he was Mr. 10%. He took 10% on every deal CONCACAF did. And he did build a lot of the stuff because it was building from ground zero. But that's obviously that's a shady situation right there. But then Chuck at FIFA became powerful because he ran their sort of broadcast committee, which, you know, they're the ones who sold the rights for the World Cups to countries around the world. And Chuck became a powerful figure in that. I remember in 2006 being at the MLS title game when I was sort of hanging out outside of the owners meeting in Dallas, and Chuck walked in and got a standing ovation. I could hear it on the other side of the door. And that was because Chuck had done a deal where NBC had agreed the rights for the World Cup, and Chuck convinced FIFA to rescind their deal with NBC and instead do a deal with ESPN ABC that included MLS being packaged with the World Cup rights, which was something that basically helped save MLS and brought them a lot of money. So that's why he was getting a standing ovation from the MLS owners. Chuck is was kind of like one of those charming mob bosses. He was a really charming guy. You know, he had a table at Elaine's in New York, where a lot of people in the media business and elsewhere, like Dan Jenkins used to have a table at Elaine's, and Chuck was part of that scene. I remember the night before the vote in 2010, I was in Zurich at the fancy FIFA hotel where the sting operation would take place 5 years later. And I was sitting next to Chuck, Mia Hamm, and Nomar the night before the vote, when most of us thought the U.S. was going to get the World Cup. And you know, Chuck was a charming guy. He would tell stories. His girlfriend at the time, who's in the movie extensively, Mary Lynn, got to know her. You know, like I felt a little bit like one of those reporters covering, you got to know these New York mob bosses back in the day, where you knew that they weren't clean, and yet it was very hard to get stuff on them, and they were kind of charming.
Grant, that's an interesting thing about Chuck. Hello?
Yep, you're there.
We got you.
All right, there you go. Start recording. That's an interesting thing about Chuck is that the level of influence and power that he had domestically, which I guess escapes me because there are a lot of people who have money in this country that don't seem to have the sort of power and influence that Chuck Blazer had. And his source of his power was in a sport that is behind a lot of other sports in this country. So how did he do it?
Well, his power base really wasn't the U.S. His power base
Caribbean
was CONCACAF, and the power base in CONCACAF is the Caribbean. And Jack Warner was basically Chuck's running mate. Chuck was like the equivalent of the vice president to Jack the president. Jack represented all the Caribbean countries, got them all to unify and maximize the power they had as, I don't know, we're talking about 25 votes in the FIFA election for president, which gives them enormous power. And Jack didn't want to do the day-to-day growing of the business of CONCACAF. Chuck was the one who took care of that. And then Chuck would get commissions on all of that. So it was almost like Jack was the figurehead who represented the Caribbean and focused on the politics side of it, but didn't have to do that much. And Chuck was the guy who actually did build like the Gold Cup as a tournament and wrung as much money out of it as possible. That's why it takes place every 2 years. That's why it takes place in the U.S. every 2 years, as opposed to rotating it around. So, like the weird thing about it, though, is the fact that Chuck didn't even file income tax. And that's how they kind of got onto him at first. Like, that's a brazen, stupid thing to do.
That's the mob boss piece of this. I mean, that is when you keep talking about them being a crime family, and suddenly I'm watching The Untouchables, and it's like, he has not filed a return since 1927. Right? I mean, that was like wild watching that piece of it, and I think that is one of the most damning elements of it, where at the very least, there is corruption there. Like you can say, okay, well, what's going to happen? It was very clear watching those 4 episodes, this place is a mess, and that there's no accountability, and that they rely on that lack of accountability. I mean, one of the things that I thought that is probably never going to happen, I don't cover FIFAs, but I would imagine it would never happen, is they're the Senate, but they need to become the House of Representatives in terms of the one country, one vote. That is the central. But if you do that, then it becomes a European organization. You'll lose every time, right?
Yeah, it's hard to figure out what's the best way for FIFA to organize itself. And I don't even know if it's possible to change in some ways. They have made what they call their FIFA council larger. So it used to be 24 men, and it was all men who voted on the host countries for 2018 and 22. And so if you were able to put money in the pockets of those 24 men, you'd win. And literally that's what Qatar did and Russia did, according to the DOJ. And so would it be better for governance if it changed? Sure. One woman who's in that film, Alexandra Raghi, is a friend of mine. She tried to bring governance change inside the system, and she quit because it was such a disaster in terms of it was just impossible to fix things on the governance side, she said. And she also ran into the fact that it's so male dominated, and the culture is still anti-women
really
soccer,
anti-women.
Yeah, anti-women in any sort of power there.
So now we are living the 2022 Qatar World Cup, and being on the ground there and all of the lead up and the questions about how this event would come off, not just on the field, but off it, and whether players would be able to protest. And we've seen little pockets of it with the Iranian team not singing the national anthem, but there's been other pieces of it, whether it's like the, equal rights for all armbands that have been quelled completely by the threat of starting on a yellow card. What has the experience been like on the ground for you personally, and then as well as looking at it from like a systemic protest point of view about what could have happened with this platform and what has actually happened?
And your piece in the protest.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I guess I'll start with the One Love armbands, which in my opinion were a very lukewarm idea in the first place. They weren't even a rainbow. It was like different colors, but not quite a rainbow. And it wasn't a very strong statement to begin with. It was a statement though, but it was so threatening to FIFA and to the Qatari hosts that FIFA did something they've never really done before, which is to threaten specific in-game punishments of yellow cards for any country that did that. And there's no rule in FIFA that says that they're supposed to do that. So it was a sign of how worried FIFA and the Qatari host were about even a minor protest happening. And right now, Germany's threatening legal action against FIFA over this. And it was the German players who their starting 11 put their hands over their mouths to say they were being silenced, which is still the strongest showing of protest about the One Love armbands. Kate did mention the Iranians protesting their own government's treatment of women by not saying the words to the national anthem. And, they got cracked down on after that by the regime. And so they ended up sort of half-heartedly singing the words for the next 2 games. We haven't seen any of the U.S. players protest in any way, shape, or form against migrant workers or for migrant workers in Qatar or any other LGBTQ or women's rights situation. I know the U.S. players have been educated by experts that the U.S. Soccer Federation has brought in. So they're aware of stuff. U.S. Soccer did put up a rainbow badge at the media center here that got attention the first day. And it seemed like U.S. Soccer was doing smart stuff. And then before the Iran game, U.S. Soccer posts an Iranian flag without the symbol of the Islamic Republic and says, oh, by the way, this was intentional. We're supporting women in their protests there. And obviously they were very well-meaning in supporting women, but I still don't totally understand why they put a different flag out there for Iran, because that could be taken to mean anti-Islam or any other thing. And how would you like it, U.S., if Iran defaced your flag? I mean, like, you always have to think about that in terms of international diplomacy or lack thereof.
Well, Grant, I think that's the most surprising thing about that move for me, was to find out that it wasn't part of a coordinated effort from within U.S. Soccer, the federation, and the team on the ground. That it was kind of like, you know what? Let's give this a whirl. How surprised were you? And what was the kind of behind the scenes? What was the thought process behind that without involving anyone else and kind of educating them about what was coming down the pipe?
Yeah, I mean, the State Department of the United States put out their own statement saying, look, we weren't involved in this. And, you know, the players of the U.S. team, the coach of the U.S. team said, we weren't involved in this. And the coach of the U.S. team actually apologized in the press conference the day after it happened. So everyone around it feels like it was well-meaning. It was just poorly handled, and it wasn't done through the proper channels. And how would the U.S. feel if Iran put out a Confederate flag for the United States or something?
I mean,
I know some folks in the States would love it.
Probably.
I guess, like, to me, the action is one thing. Well-meaning or not, the right move or not, that's one thing. But it's another thing. Let's say they had done, for instance, not the flag, but some other form of outward protest through this. But to not involve anybody who would ultimately be the ones who'd have to answer for it, that's the part that I'm kind of more curious about. It's not about what they did to the flag or what would happen if the Iranians that did that to the American flag. It's about why wasn't anyone conferred with or debriefed, like, this is happening, guys.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the process wasn't great, clearly. And then there was this surreal press conference the day before the U.S.-Iran game where you literally have Iranian state media throwing wild questions about the U.S. military fleet in the Persian Gulf to the U.S. soccer coach, who's like, I'm a coach. You know, there's nothing for me to say about this. And I did think, actually, that Tyler Adams handled a pretty hostile question quite well, and ended up diffusing it and making himself look good and making the U.S. look good in a really weird situation. Press conferences here are wild. I mean, like, I'm fascinated by the science of the FIFA moderator and how they pick who asks questions at these press conferences, because I went to the Iran press conference about an hour before the U.S. one, and the moderator didn't call in a single American. And we had our hands up. It was just Iranians, and did not call in a single woman. And my friend Roxana Saberi at CBS News was there and just frantically raising her hand. She's Iranian American. She was imprisoned in Iran in a political prisoner type situation in the early 2000s, wrote a book about it. And she's like trying to ask a question, and toward the end of it, with another woman saying, you haven't called on a woman yet, you need to call on a woman. And the FIFA moderator refused. So only men ask questions, were allowed to ask questions in that press conference for Iran, only Iranians, no Americans. And then for the US press conference an hour later, the different FIFA moderator called on a half dozen Iranians who were state affiliated and were doing a performance for their regime.
How much think it was that hostile a question, believe it or not?
The first part of it, totally fine on pronouncing the country. That's I'm totally cool with that. You had to sort of be in the room to see how it was, to hear how it was asked of Adams, and the way it was put toward him. And I guess you could hear it, and it was in plain English.
Yeah, it certainly wasn't fair. It certainly wasn't fair to him. However, if I combine two things, one thing, thinking about the FIFA Uncovered doc, when they talk about sports washing, we never talk about the United States. We never talk about Jim Crow. We talk about 1936. We don't talk about 1932, the Civil Rights Movement. We talk about the 1960 Olympics. You never talk about the fact that these sports do the United States a lot of good. And that during that period, you had, whether it was Paul Robeson or his wife or Malcolm X over the years, wanting to appeal to the UN about the things that the United States are doing at home to Black people. You go to tennis, and we talked about feng shui. And so what happened to the Chinese athletes? They were all asked about feng shui. They were asked about the things that were happening at home. I didn't think it was out of bounds necessarily to ask Americans what we do here, because we ask everybody else. We look at tennis with the war in Ukraine, the number of Russian athletes who have been put on the spot to talk about the geopolitics of what's happening in their country. I don't know how it played in the room, but it is very curious to me that we do ask these things of other athletes, but very rarely do they get asked of us.
I would say this. I would say that asking Tyler Adams about Black Lives Matter and the discrimination against Black Americans, it was an antagonistic question, but not totally out of bounds. And the way that Adams answered it, I thought, was pretty solid. You know, part of my issue, and I've talked about this with Lillian Thuram, who's devoted his entire post-playing career to fighting racism in soccer globally. You know, he's always like, why do y'all ask the Black guys these questions?
The Black guy is the way that we deal with all racism in the United States.
You know, so like, you know, why not ask the white players or the white coach? Like, why was Adams asked this question instead of Greg Berhalter, the white coach sitting next to him? And that makes sense to me as well. Yeah. Like, there was a range of questions, though. I mean, asking Greg Berhalter about the U.S. military fleet in the Persian Gulf, like, that's bizarre to me.
Yeah. I want to go back to the FIFA moderator selection of the questioners, but in general, all of these kind of knee-jerk, almost authoritarian actions by FIFA throughout these games. Is this FIFA? Is this Qatar? In the case of the Iranian press conference, is it Iran? Like, who is the main motivator and instigator for these crackdowns behind these individual actions? Or is this FIFA just saying, we're not going to have any shenanigans?
There's a real sense that FIFA is not in control of this World Cup. And we've seen this in a number of ways, right? So 2 days before the tournament starts, after 12 years of preparations and Qatar saying their regime that will allow alcoholic beer to be sold in stadiums, and Budweiser's a huge sponsor of the World Cup. 2 days before the tournament starts, and they didn't decide this 2 days before, they announced that, oh yeah, we're not going to have alcoholic beer in the stadiums here. And that wasn't really about beer. It was about, we want to have control over this, and you, FIFA, do not, because you want us to be able to sell beer in stadiums because that makes you money and helps your relationship with Budweiser. So there's other examples, right? And this is where my little situation comes in, where even before the tournament, I was asking FIFA, I was asking U.S. Soccer, what is going to happen with people who wear rainbow t-shirts, have rainbow flags in a country where being gay is illegal? And everyone at FIFA, everyone at U.S. Soccer said, we are told there will be zero problem with rainbows in those circumstances. If you are doing a number of different things to draw attention to yourself, like if you're making out with your partner in public in a country where PDA is really, really frowned upon of any type, if you're doing that while wearing a rainbow flag and you've had a couple of cocktails over, or a bunch of cocktails over at the W Hotel, then you're probably going to get stopped. But in terms of getting into stadiums, they were very clear saying, no problem. So that was what was going on in my head when I'm wearing a t-shirt to the first US game of the tournament that has a soccer ball and a rainbow on it. And so I was surprised, actually, when I got detained. I was not expecting that. And
what capacity, Grant? I'm sorry to cut you off there. What capacity were you in? Were you a fan, or were you working that day?
I was working that day. I had a credential. I was entering through the media checkpoint into the stadium grounds. And, you know, you go through a metal detector. It's pretty straightforward. And they stopped me at first. And then about a minute or two later, they said, your shirt's a problem. You need to remove your shirt to enter the stadium. I said, why? And they said, it's not allowed. It's a political statement. And I was like, it's not a political statement. It's a human rights statement. And by the way, FIFA's said this would be no problem for any visitor to this country for the World Cup, but that you're welcoming the world. They responded by continuing to say, you have to take your shirt off, me saying no. And then I ended up being sort of pushed to the side to wait, surrounded by about 10 security guards. Eventually had one of them stand above me, angrily continuing to demand that I take the shirt off. They forcibly took my phone from my hands and kept it for half an hour. And then made me stand up and face a CCTV camera, someone on the other end of it, I guess. And then finally, after 25, 30 minutes, a commander of security came and said to me, you can go in, you can keep your shirt on, we apologize. So that's kind of how it played out. But like,
what do you think happened? What happened there? How does it
well,
go
I did have time
to
yeah, I mean, I did have time before they took my phone to tweet out just a quick picture of me and what they were saying to me. I think they took my phone because I was taking a selfie and they thought I was taking a picture of them, and they really don't like it when you take a picture of them. And so we had a brief struggle, and then I'm thinking, yeah, I really don't want to fight this like physically at this point. So, but that tweet got the attention of FIFA, which then went into crisis mode and sent FIFA people to the stadium. They weren't previously there. And that's how it went. FIFA came to me afterward, apologized. And like, look, it was more annoying than anything. I wasn't like in fear or anything. And the main thing I would point out is, with the world looking at Qatar, they're still doing this stuff that FIFA doesn't want them to do, trying to exert control. Think what it's like when the world attention isn't on Qatar, and if you're a gay person in Qatar, what that must be like.
Well, FIFA, this is also what you get when you're bought.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How many World Cups have you covered?
This is my 8th men's. I've done 5 women's.
So you've been to this 13th World Cup. What would you say, leaving the interaction aside when you were trying to go into the stadium with the rainbow shirt on, what has the experience on the ground been like in Qatar? What is it like? Because I was considering going, because I always want to go to the World Cup because I love it, but I couldn't wrap my mind around going to a country where being gay is illegal. Right.
I mean, it's a weird place. This is my 3rd trip here. I first came in 2013 and I came in February of this year. I had one other incident with security the first week when I was picking up my accreditation and just was waiting in line, took a picture very innocently of the slogan of the World Cup on the wall, and the security guard came over and said, no pictures here, even though there was no sign saying that, and then said, kindly delete the phone, or delete the picture from your phone, sir. And I've never had like a security guard tell me I had to delete pictures from my phone. And so we had a little fun stare down, and he wasn't going to escalate it any further. I didn't end up deleting it. So just that type of stuff, that's what they're wired, the security people, to do here. In terms of like the day-to-day, I've had those 2 security situations, but like it's pretty straightforward, and it's been mostly easy on the ground here from a logistical perspective. Unlike other World Cups, all the stadiums are in basically the same city. There's Ubers everywhere. It's very easy to get around. It's basically first world in most ways. Like I have a delivery app that brings me groceries and restaurant food. I'm staying in a 3-floor townhouse with 3 other international journalists. It's probably the nicest housing situation I've had for any World Cup. So all of those parts of it have been fine. And so infrastructure-wise, they've spent $220 billion on this. So like that's more than any previous World Cup and Olympics combined. So everything's new, including the house I'm talking to you from right now.
Yeah. it is interesting thinking about that staggering amount of money for this event. But it also, once again, for everything that we've talked about the last 2 weeks, last week's show and this week's show, it does show you the immense influence and power. And we were talking about this last week about how small the Super Bowl feels to this, how small the World Series feels to this, and the NBA Finals, and all the things that are our flagship when we use the word world. This is not world. This is world. And I wanted to switch gears just for a bit when we have a minute. One of the things that I thought that the FIFA Uncovered doc, I mean, obviously it was crazy, was how many people they got on camera. I mean, when you do a documentary, the very first thing that you're working on is, who do we get? Who can we get? Switching gears to the process of Good Rivals and all of that. How was the process for you? How was it being involved, coming off of all the work that you've done on this anyway, to sort of see this come to light, challenges, successes, failures, things that you experienced in this?
Should we tell the listener quickly, like,
Go ahead. Yes, please.
Good Rivals being the first documentary put out in partnership with Meadowlark and Skydance. And Grant, I know you were an EP on it as well, discussing the rivalry between Mexico, U.S. men's soccer. It's out now on Amazon. Just so our listeners
and Apple TV Plus, exactly. And Grant, were you a producer or an EP?
I think you promoted me to EP. I was a producer on it.
I think you were a producer on it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't want to take that away from you. I was just making sure I saw the credits right. That's all.
That's right.
But that was the first documentary film project series I've ever worked on. I've been interviewed for some in the past, and I'm in this one, but to be on the production side was a really fascinating new experience for me. And I mean, this was John Skipper's baby, this idea of doing a documentary series on this U.S.A.-Mexico soccer rivalry, which goes so far beyond the playing field, even though there's a lot of great stuff to talk about in the history of the rivalry on the playing field. But getting into issues of identity and immigration and what it means to be Mexican, what it means to be American, and what a border means, if anything. Just because I always sort of distill it into one sentence, which is, outside of World Cups, the most popular soccer team in the United States is the Mexican national team. And that is sort of a thesis statement for the entire film series, and how the U.S. has gotten better in the rivalry on the field as U.S. soccer has grown, but what it means to Mexicans as well. And so this was a project that took over a year, start to finish, and ended up involving 3 production companies. It was just a wonderful group of people to work with on both sides of the border, because we wanted to tell this story 50% from the U.S. perspective and 50% from the Mexico perspective, which meant doing a lot of interviews in English and Spanish with past stars, current stars, experts on social movements and immigration and everything like that. And I'm really happy with how the whole thing turned out, which is a good feeling, I wasn't the director, but I certainly was involved in looking at the cuts as they went along and execute. I did most of the interviews on the English U.S. side. I did use my Spanish a little bit when there were Mexican figures in L.A., for example, because there's a lot of Mexican Americans in L.A. But then they took care of a lot of interviews on the other side of the border. The stars are essentially Landon Donovan and Rafael Marquez, who represent so much on either side of the rivalry. And I covered a lot of these events when they happened over the years. And I always knew we had good stuff when I would be learning new things from these interviews. Like Rafa Marquez saying that the reason he's disliked the United States so much over the years and gotten 2 red cards against the U.S. in huge games is that his grandfather abandoned the family and went to the United States, but wasn't sending money back, had abandoned them. And that left a huge impression on young Rafa Marquez and his family about what the United States signified. And so revelations like that, and there's great stuff from Landon too about his connection to in Southern California to Mexican soccer in a style of play, takes this, I think, to a higher level, hopefully.
Who radicalized you? Grandpa.
Wait, go ahead. Amin, sorry.
I was gonna say, yeah, that was, and I think Rafa Marquez talked about like having a whole side of the family over there that would come home and act like they were better than us, and so that revelatory for sure. This is gonna sound like a silly question. I feel like a lot of times we're tough media people and we, down the line, but who are you most excited to get on camera?
I mean, I really do think that the depth of Donovan and Marquez is stuff that we haven't seen before from the two biggest stars from either side of the rivalry. And so I mentioned the stuff about what we learned from Rafa, but from Donovan, there's this arc that he takes from early in his career being arch villain number one to Mexico fans because he scored big goals against them. And actually, early Landon Donovan would troll Mexico with his quotes a lot. And what ended up happening was he seemed to enjoy being the heel in that. And then later in his career, Donovan does an about face and becomes sort of beloved in parts of Mexico. He speaks Spanish. They appreciate that. He ends up playing for León, is the last team he ends up playing with in outdoor soccer, at least. And they respect his choice to go down there. And then very famously in 2018, when the U.S. failed to qualify for the World Cup, Landon Donovan did a whole ad campaign and made good money, by the way, saying my other team is Mexico, I'm supporting Mexico, and took all sorts of heat from his former U.S. teammates about doing that. And so it's very interesting to hear Landon's perspective on, okay, aside from the obvious monetary benefits for that, he claims that he does feel a connection to Mexico and that he's become a more mature person over the years who kind of wants the border to go away. And he does say some pretty insightful things about the border in particular in this film.
Big game Saturday. What are you looking for? I remember I was hearing someone say the other day that, once the Americans end up playing one of the traditional powers, it's game over. Is that how you feel about this match with the Netherlands?
I mean, I should be up front. Like before the tournament started, I put my predictions out. I had the U.S. facing the Netherlands. I had Netherlands winning.
You got to hold to that now, right?
And like, look, I mean, fine. I still think if I were choosing a winner of this game, it would be the Dutch. However, I look at how the teams have played since the tournament started, and the Netherlands has not been quite as good as I was expecting them to be. Not bad. They won their group, but they tied Ecuador, and Ecuador made the Netherlands look fairly ordinary, I thought. And if Ecuador can do that, the U.S. can do that, especially the way the U.S. has played defensively in this tournament. Aside from that one brain fart when Wales got the late penalty, nobody scored against the U.S. It's been a really good team performance defensively, all 11 guys on the field. Not producing enough in terms of the attack, probably, and not producing enough goals. That's the big concern for the U.S. And if that's the case, why isn't Gio Reyna playing? He's one of your two most creative goal-producing guys.
Let's ask that question right now.
Why isn't he playing?
I had lunch with a friend of Gio Reyna's today and was just trying to get some insight on what's going on. And there's, according to the people I've talked to, no incident happened between Gio Reyna and Greg Berhalter, the coach. Gio Reyna's not injured, and he's just really disappointed. He's only played 7 minutes in the second game against England, and And yes, Tim Weah has performed well, scored a goal in the first game. You know, probably should have had a goal. It got disallowed, I guess, for the right reason, against Iran. But it's still crazy to me that Reyna hasn't been playing. But you have to understand, too, the relationship between Greg Berhalter, his family, and Gio Reyna's family is extremely close, because Greg Berhalter went to high school with Claudio Reyna in New Jersey. They played together. They obviously played together on the national team in World Cups. The mothers of Gio Reyna, or the mother of Gio Reyna and the wife of Greg Berhalter, played at UNC together, the flagship program of women's college soccer for decades. So Greg Berhalter's known Gio Reyna since he was born and knows him extremely well. So there's no sort of hatred here from Greg Berhalter toward Gio Reyna. It's just a strange, unexplained situation. And yes, you do wonder, is there more to this? What's going on? And so far, I haven't been able to get any evidence of that.
And Grant, what's the latest on Christian?
So Christian Pulisic actually spoke at the press conference tonight and said he plans to play on Saturday. He has what they're calling a pelvic contusion, which is some sort of euphemism, but I guess it's the bone in that area that got hit, Pulisic said. And it's uncomfortable and caused a fair amount of pain. He had to go to the hospital as a precautionary measure during the second half of the Iran game, and he was following the game on a phone on his way there. Will he be at 100% against the Netherlands? Who knows? But I do think he'll play. This is the biggest game in Christian Pulisic's life. He's been waiting 20 years for this. And you don't get too many elimination game cracks at the Dutch. I do feel like this is going to be a little bit like the U.S.-England game in terms of the Dutch are going to have the majority of the possession, and the U.S. is going to have to try and strike on the counter or get set pieces and score off those and have to execute really well. But I actually think the U.S. might even play better as a counterattacking team. Where they can really struggle is they have a hard time breaking down overly defensive opponents like Iran in the first half the other night, who get 10 men behind the ball. The U.S. has a really hard time breaking down those teams.
Well, there we go. Once again, everybody's watching. Big game Saturday, the Orange, and then the U.S. Grant, thank you. What time is it over there?
It is 9:14 p.m., 8 hours later than U.S. Eastern time.
There we go. And so Amin's the one who's the farthest away from you. Are you in Arizona or are you in Florida?
I'm in Arizona.
There we go. Grant, thank you so much for this. It was great. We will see you when we see you. And
Meadowlark team get together, I hope, at some point.
Exactly.
Let's do it.
It's only been here 18 months. I still haven't been in Florida. Whatever. Right. Next week, we got to give Grant his wish on this as well, because we've got Meadowlarkers 58, and as we're approaching 60.
Wait, are we naming 2 episodes in the same?
We're naming captains.
Kind of like
this is very Russia.
Well,
no, we're not naming. We're not. Exactly. We're giving Russia for 2018. Exactly. We're giving Derek Thomas 58, and then we're giving whoever wears number 60 for Qatar. Exactly. But obviously, there'll be a lot of competition next week, whether it's Jonathan Papelbon or Carl Banks or Derek Thomas or the great, of course, maybe the greatest 58, Jack Lambert, Pittsburgh Steelers. Lot of comp for that. Kate Fagan is rolling her eyes. Amin is laughing. We will see you next week on Meadowlarkers 58.